My name is John Deal. I am an editor and historian here at the Library of Virginia, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this talk by Virginia Humanities Research Fellow Tev'n Powers on his amazing project, Fugitive Data Portraits, Self-Emancipation in Virginia. One of the pleasures I have is serving as a liaison for Virginia Humanities Research Fellows who spend time here at the Library of Virginia, either a semester or even an academic year, sort of doing a deep dive into the collections here at the library for a variety of projects. And we've been partnering with Virginia Humanities for more than a decade. And I'd like to acknowledge, I know we have a handful of folks from Virginia Humanities here with us today. Before we get started, I'd like to do a plug for the upcoming exhibition here at the library. It's called House to Highway, Reclaiming a Community History, about the development of Richmond's Jackson Ward neighborhood, which was once the center of Richmond's Black community. It opens here at the library on July 14th with an opening program on the evening of July 17th. And now to our talk today. Tev'n Powers describes himself as a web developer, data scientist, and community historian. His project brings these interests together in an effort to share what he's learned about the courageous Black women and children who escaped from slavery in Virginia. He used a variety of library manuscript resources, but today he's going to focus on the runaway and escaped slaves records, which is part of the library's Virginia Untold digital resource, to highlight the lives and impact of the enslaved people who escaped to the Union during the Civil War.
Thank you, John, for the intro. And thank you to everyone in attendance here. I see a lot of familiar names in the chat. And also a lot of gratitude for the names I don't recognize, for the folks who saw this project in the wild and figured that it might be of some interest to them or some utility to the work you do. Thank you for your support. As John mentioned, I am wrapping up my tenure as a Virginia Humanities Fellow. I had the pleasure of working here at the Library of Virginia for 4 months between last year and this year. And John and the other folks here were kind enough to let me extend my stay here a few extra months working on this project, Fugitive Data Portraits. So again, thank you to the library for your support, to those of you here. And I'm going to talk about my project today. I'm going to talk about how it came to be, and most importantly, I'm going to talk about some important people in Black history who I think are often unnamed or altogether omitted from conversations when we talk about emancipation, especially in the context of Juneteenth. And in the Black freedom struggle in general. So when I set out to work on this project, to build this website, the goal was really for it to be a manifestation of my learning process of how I've come to learn about the people that we'll be talking about today, and how I've come to learn about the history of runaway slaves in general or self-emancipation in general in Virginia. So, over the last few months working on it, I've had the pleasure of connecting with different historians, librarians, archivists who have helped me take a project that I was building out of my personal interest for myself to learn about, this part of Virginia history and these people. They've helped me turn that from something that, might just be of interest to me and into something that might be of interest and use for other folks. So. Thank you there. And so to start with, I'll give a little bit of background on myself and how this project came to be. If you're interested in pulling the site up yourself, I think there's a link in the chat to fugitivedataportraits.com. If you Google it, it should also come up pretty easily. So the website is very much still in progress, but I'm excited to finally have it in a state that's worth sharing publicly and that I think, can begin to sort of communicate what I'm trying to get across with the project. So as we bounce around from a few pages, you'll see some pages look a little more bare than others. We'll spend most of our time today looking into this contraband of war that chapter of the site. But I will talk to you about what the remaining pages will look like in the future. So I'm gonna try to keep my talk to about 30 minutes. Walk you through, the project motivations, the state of the project itself now, show you some of the data that I've worked with, the archives and narratives that I've been pulling from, and then get into also talking about what the next stages of the project are. So, what are fugitive data portraits? What is a data portrait? And so I'll begin by just talking about how I came to this project. My background is in software engineering, software development, web development. As John mentioned, I've worked at I work a lot with language and data over my now 10, 12 year career as an engineer. Um, but folks often ask me how I end up working on a project like this, which is very much a history focused project, and a lot of archival research. There's a lot of conversation about STEM versus humanities, and I'm grateful to, be able to work at the intersection of those interests. So I'm sort of new to this digital humanities space, but I've had a lot of great conversations with folks who've help me find my way of the land in this space. So, like most good things in life, this project actually, of this project, I would say, were started in a book club a few years ago. I organized with a group of friends. We organized under the group Black Praxis Project, and so early in the pandemic, we began facilitating these online political education sessions, study groups, book clubs, and we would just get together and read material from the Black radical tradition, and make a space for us to discuss those stories and and thoughts together. And so one of the books we read was by Sadia Hartman called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. And she spends her time looking at the lives of young Black women early in the 20th century. So the early 1900s, 1920s. Um, and she speaks a lot about working with the archives to sort of dig through uh, journals, photos, social worker, medical records to sort of uncover the stories of Black women who otherwise at the time were not really seen as historical figures and prominent actors to be studied and documented and noted. These stories weren't being captured. And so she sort of does this work of pouring through these archives, uncovering stories and trying to amplify them in her text. So I like to start off describing this project with this quote from her, which if I can move the camera out of the way. All right. She has a quote in the introduction to her book from a section called "A Note on Method," where she's talking about her methodology. And she says, "Every historian of the multitude, the dispossessed, the subaltern, and the enslaved is forced to grapple with the power and authority of the archive and the limits it sets on what can be known, whose perspective matters, and who is endowed with the gravity and authority of historical actor." So this sort of that quote I think speaks to sort of the motivation that the orientation that I approached this project with. I've looked through these records from public accounts, from financial records, journals from Civil War lieutenants. Come across these data sets of runaway and escaped slaves. And these were people who were not at the time, of course, considered to be important historical figures, historical actors, or worthy of consideration in that sort of conversation. In fact, they were considered to be property at the time. And so the work of fugitive data portraits is to sort of take these names that are documented in these property records of the time and and put them in the same conversation that I put the many Black leaders, revolutionaries, important historical actors that we know and revere today. And so that sort of speaks to how I sort of approach the archive, that book by Saidiya Hartman really planting the seeds that there's stories worth uncovering in the archive, that there's rich materials worth discovering in these archives. And so that's the archival side of it, and then the data side of things. I'm a fan of big fan of W.E.B. Du Bois, who many of you probably have heard of. Um, the seeds for this concept of data portraits, I think, were planted when I discovered a book that some editors compiled called W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits, and what they do in this book is compile a series of data visualizations that he and his team of scholars created in the early, I think it was actually in 1900 at the Paris Exposition. They presented a series of panels which each showed various data visualizations, um, where the intent was to communicate the progress of Black Americans during Reconstruction, and post-slavery. So this was a time where I don't think data visualizations as a field, as a concept, was all that popular, all that known as a means of communicating sociology theories and ideas. And so Du Bois, I think, was one of the first people to sort of take that approach. And so um, a very small little Easter egg throughout the site is I found this font that you'll see pop up throughout the site. This is actually the same font that he used in his visualizations and posters at this Paris exhibition. And there's a type foundry called Vocal Type, I believe, founded by a young man named Trey Seals, who they recreated this font digitally. So it was a nice touch to be able to pay homage to that sort of piece of the motivation of the project by actually including it through the project. What I very quickly found in working on this project is that the data shows that sort of macro view of the experiences of the self-emancipated people of Virginia. But as my goal, my primary goal when I came across that data set was to learn more about these people, about their stories. And the data simply doesn't communicate that to me. So the concept of a data portrait is using contemporary narratives or other archival materials to speak to the personal experiences, to contextualize the data side of the story. So the idea is to bring both of those sides together, the narrative and the data, to then sort of fill in these gaps of what can be known about these historical actors. And then a last note that I meant to mention on that last page as well was the importance of fugitivity. It was important for me to include that language in the title as well. Because fugitivity, acts of fugitivity, the concept of fugitivity are important to the history of the Black freedom struggle. So many, most, if not all of the leaders and groups that we revere for their work as freedom fighters were labeled fugitives by their contemporaries or by the government at the time. And so I don't want that point to be missed here, that these people who we might revere as heroes and um, people that should be celebrated today were included in these records because of fugitive activity. And so I use it not at all in a derogatory sense, but to recognize the value in fugitive activity, the value in recognizing that the institutions and society around you are operating at their best to make it seem like an injustice or a form of oppression is the natural order of things. But many people know, the people in this archive that we're about to discuss knew that there was a different world out there, that there was a different world to be created, and they did their part in bringing that world about. So, without further ado, let's talk about the United States contraband of war policy that became relevant during the Civil War, and the role that Virginia played in that policy, the role that these Black women, men, children played in this policy, in the war, and in emancipation in general. So, if you know me, you probably know I'm a data nerd. I'm always on the lookout for data sets to explore, data sets that seem to have stories worth telling in them. And so last April, well, a few years ago, I came across the Library of Virginia's runaway and escaped slaves records. This is on the Virginia Open Data Portal. This is actually the site I was digging through, just looking for any sort of data sets that might be worth, starting a project on. And I came across these records and it immediately caught my eye. And when you download the data set, it comes in a spreadsheet sort of like this, where you can see information about dates of escape, the name of the person who escaped, their gender, age, whether they were with child, who the enslaver was, which county it's from, the record is from, and any occupation or other noteworthy remarks to be made about them. So I came across that data set a couple years ago, and it was about last April that I emailed Lydia Nuroff out the blue. She's the project manager for the Virginia Untold collection here at the Library of Virginia, and these records that we're just looking at are part of that collection. Um, so I emailed her out the blue saying, "Hey, I'm interested in learning about this archive. I'm building this project on my own to explore the archive. I don't know if you and your team are interested in seeing what I'm up to." And a few weeks later, we set up a meeting in person, and I showed them the very, very, very earliest seeds of this website. And they were very encouraging, supportive. And from there, that led to this fellowship opportunity. Um, and so when I came across the data, I began to explore the names of people. I wonder who they were, what their stories were. And it was clear to me, in the words of Sadia Hartman again, they were included, the people were included in these records, not because they were viewed as historical actors, but it very quickly set in that, these were property records that were filed with various counties throughout the state of Virginia. And in fact, they were property loss records. Saying that, these people escaped to the Union, escaped to the enemy during the war, but we are filing them with essentially the Office of Public Accounts at the time, which was essentially the state treasury, to say, this is now, my financial record should reflect the fact that I have less property this year than I had last year. Um, so with that said, let's walk through this data essay, this visual essay that I've written, and talk about some of the data that shows up here in this collection, some of the narratives and stories we can uncover. To begin with, I just wanted to set the context by again just making clear where this collection comes from. Emphasizing the fact that these self-emancipated individuals were considered property in the state of Virginia. And so in 1863, the state passed an act of assembly, which, required the Commissioner of Revenue in each county to go and figure out how many slaves had escaped in their counties, and then report that back to the state's public account office. So in this collection, there's about 5,000 individuals, 4,954 to be exact, who are listed as having escaped between the years of 1861 and 1863 during the Civil War. Um, I've had the pleasure of doing a Q&A with Lydia and a few other archivists here at the Library of Virginia. And so as we go through the site, you'll notice that there's some small notes or small pop-outs that speak to some of the meta, my experience working with these archives, and some of the important notes that the archivists themselves would want you to know as you're engaging with and thinking through this archive. So, for example, much of the language that's used, even the name Runaway Slaves Records, this might be language that we would not use to describe the people in these collections, but in the spirit of historical accuracy, there's language that pops up that is meant to maintain accuracy with the historical records themselves, not necessarily reflect the point of view of today's historians and archivists working with them. So each record that we just looked through in the spreadsheet, for the most part, contains a lot of information about the identity of the person, from their gender, their age, their sex, and where they escaped from. as far as occupations go, we see things like carpenter, blacksmith, midwife, um, all things that sort of are speaking to, again, the idea that these enslavers are suffering property damage, property losses, with each person that escapes. And what this really drives home is that each person, each row in this data set represents someone whose life up to and evidenced by their inclusion in this archive have been reduced to a unit of labor or production at that time. And so again, one thing I've really learned when I first approached this project, I'm thinking I've got this rich archive of about 5,000 people. I'm gonna take this collection and combine it with other archives and uncover the stories of these people. But I very quickly realized that working with this archive alone would not be enough because it only shows the point of view or this phenomenon of self-emancipation from the point of view of the enslavers themselves, right? Again, these are property records. But uh, what I'll speak to a little later when we get to the other pages of the project are some other narratives and materials that I'm hoping to pull into the project that help. As we see, I have a few examples on this page of individuals being able to speak in their own words about their acts of self-emancipation. But I also have records from William Still's compilation of Underground Railroad escapes. William Still was a conductor on the Philadelphia station of the Underground Railroad and chairman of their vigilance committee who would welcome people in when they made their journeys to Philadelphia. So he would welcome them at the anti-slavery office and then take down their testimonies. So there's about 300 individuals who came through that station and were escaping from Virginia, whose testimonies he wrote down, and that I'll share on this website in the future. But the reason I bring that archive up now is because that is an important uh counter narrative to sort of think and hold as we're thinking about the contraband of war records that we're about to go through. So these records which exist because enslavers were filing their property records with the state versus the Underground Railroad records, which William Still recorded because he was aware that these stories of escape, what he calls hairbreadth escapes and close call fugitive activity, he recognized the value in recording those stories, the importance of those stories and these people being included in the historical record as actors. So on one hand, I'm able to use that archive to sort of just present and amplify William Still's message. On the other hand, with these property records, there's the work of excavating these names and pulling them from these property records and placing them in the conversation with the people in William Still's archive, with the revolutionaries and leaders in the Black freedom struggle that we already know. So the goal, like I said, was to go through these rows of the Library of Virginia data set and begin to try to understand what the context of the world was for these people at the time. And there's not a whole lot of documentation to go off of when you're pouring through historical collections that deal with enslaved populations. In some rare cases where we get lucky, we can identify someone like Richard Slaughter here on the screen, where we can learn about their experience in their own world, in their own words. So this is someone who Richard Slaughter was born and raised in on Epps Island, right here, not far from Richmond. He was born into an enslaved family, and he escaped in 1862. Uh, in the year 1936, the Virginia Writers Project, under a broader federal writers project, went around recording interviews and conversations with formerly enslaved individuals to document those stories before they pass. And so Richard Slaughter at this time was living in Hampton, and we're fortunate to have his own testimony about his experience and his family's experience escaping on a gunboat. So he says it happened this way. Hampton was already burnt when I came here. I came to Hampton in June 1862. The Yankees burned Hampton and the fleet went up the James River. My father and mother and cousins went aboard the Maritana with me. You see, my father and three or four men left in the darkness first and got aboard. The gunboats would fire in the towns and plantations, on the towns and plantations, and run the white folks off. After that, they would carry all the colored folks back down here to Old Point and put them behind Union lines. So this is just an excerpt from Richard Slaughter's interview. You know, you can click to view the full interview here. And then this is the full interview transcript. And then of course you can always, like most things on this project, you can always get to the source material that I'm using and including in my website. You know, this might be a little bit more readable over here, more friendly to your eyes. Uh, but yeah, so this is the first of some of the narratives that we'll talk about today. But this is the idea of like, all right, we'll get into the data visualizations later, but here's a narrative that can sort of contextualize the experience of someone who might be in this collection. Richard's just one person, and we can't know, you know, the experience of all 5,000 people in this, but you know, hopefully through enough narratives, we can begin to piece together what their experiences might have been like, with the context of the world and the situations they were escaping might have been like at the time. And so this right here is just a digital sort of copy or replica of the records that we're talking about. And so if you scroll down here far enough, you know, this is one of the records that enslavers from the county of Prince George County here in Virginia would file with their commissioner of revenue, and get taken back to the state. If you look here, you've got a Richard Epps as an enslaver in this document. And then if we scroll down far enough, we'll see, here we go. We see Richard, age 13, May 20th, 1860, as having escaped. He's actually included in these records twice. I'm not exactly sure why, but we can speak to that later, and some of the sort of gaps and maybe inconsistencies in some of the records. But the important thing is that we can see and corroborate this story that he has, saying again, he came to Hampton in June 1862. And we see, you know, from, you know, he talks about being born to Richard Epps and on Epps Island, and then we see Richard Epps and a Richard age 13 in 1862 escaping. Excuse me. And so this is just, like I said, just an example of what these records might look like. And as always, again, when you're looking at some of the digital replicas or the digital copies of this records, you know, this up here reads, "This is a record of slaves that escaped to the enemy during the war from the district of James Arbuckle, Commissioner of Revenue for, at the time, Greenbrier County, West Virginia. In 1863, West Virginia hadn't yet separated from what we know as modern day Virginia. Made in pursuance of the 112th section of an act entitled uh, an act imposing taxes for support of the government." So I just clicked on this link here, and what that does is it will conduct a search for you in the Library of Virginia's website for the record that you were just viewing on my website. And with a few clicks here, you can then get down to the actual primary source records. So this is what the documents themselves that the Library of Virginia physically and digitally preserve looks like. And, you know, this is the important work of their team here and the team of volunteers that they recruit that then go through the hard work of transcribing these documents to digitize them so that projects like mine can exist. But yeah, so you can poke through this part of the site and see, you know, different records from different localities. You can also, I decided to add this small Q&A from my conversations with uh, Lydia Nuroff, Renee Savitz, and Paige Neal, who are archivists here at the Library of Virginia. And this conversation just speaks to some of the meta parts of this project. The It speaks to the background of how LVA comes into possession of these archives, the work that they go through to physically and digitally preserve them, why the library, you know, finds it important to do this work, how we can interpret gaps in the archive, uh, but just a lot of important notes from the archivists themselves about all that goes into making these records publicly available for, for us to use and view. And then also some notes on, what other type of documents exist in the Virginia Untold collection. So that's just the background on how I came to this archive, what I was hoping to do, and a sort of sample of that. So now I just wanted to provide just a little bit of historical context about what the state of Virginia was up to, what the land, what the institution of slavery looked like at this time when directly preceding the Civil War, when these men, women, and children opened the floodgates and started escaping. Um, and today I am focusing on these escapes during the Civil War, but um, the project as a whole will focus on self-emancipation throughout the entire history of Virginia's involvement in the human trafficking and labor exploitation operation. So people have been self-emancipating since the very beginning of slavery existing in the state, but today we're focusing on the context of what the institution looked like right before the Civil War and during the Civil War. So um, this part of the essay is called the Second Middle Passage. And most of us are familiar with the Middle Passage or the transatlantic slave trade, where millions of Africans were brought across the Atlantic to the Americas and enslaved. And in addition to the millions of people that were transported to the United States, or colonial America at the time, there were also over 1 million people that were transported from Virginia, or what's called states in the upper South, Maryland, Virginia. Um, there were hundreds of thousands of people, that enslaved people, that were transported from these states to the deep South, and what's called the Second Middle Passage. And so this is sort of what Virginia's role was by the time that we get to 1860, right before the Civil War. Um, uh, so there's this quote I have here. It says, slave breeding and trading gradually became more lucrative than exporting tobacco during the 18th and 19th century. Black human beings were the most lucrative and profitable export from Virginia, and Black women were bred to increase the number of enslaved people for the slave trade. So while slavery in the earliest years in Virginia, most of the institution was used to breed laborers for the agricultural production here, from the tobacco, cotton, wheat, to work those plantations. What we'll get into now is discussing how that landscape sort of changed, and how Virginia went from producing primarily enslaved laborers for the plantation work that was being done in the state, to actually becoming what someone described as a complete slave nursery to breed and produce um, more enslaved people and enslaved laborers to be sold to the deeper South, where cotton production was demanding new source of labor. So, to start with, let's understand, where Virginia is when we get to leading up to the Civil War. And so, um, in the 1790 census, this was the first census taken in the US, Virginia had an enslaved population of almost 300,000. By the time we get to 1860, Virginia has an enslaved population of nearly 500,000 people. So this map here is taken from the 1860 census records, and you can sort of poke around and see, which counties in the state, had the highest percentage of enslaved population, or had the highest raw numbers of an enslaved population. And it's unsurprising, probably if you're familiar with different areas in Virginia, it's unsurprising to see sort of where the hotbed, or the most concentration of enslaved labor exists. Um, so I won't spend too much time going through this parts, but again, from 1790 to 1860, the cotton gin was invented in 1793. So from over the next 70 years, we went from producing 1.5 million pounds of cotton as a country, to in 1860 producing 2.3 billion pounds worth of cotton. So nearly 2,000 fold increase in production of cotton because of the cotton gin. And between the cotton gin invention, Indian Removal Acts of 1830, which caused the mass expulsion of Native Americans east of the Mississippi River, um, And the ban on the transatlantic slave trade that took effect in 1808, there was new land to be worked. There were new machines to be operated, and enslavers in the Deep South needed to find a new source to supply their demand for slave labor. There was a illustrator and engraver from England that came to visit Virginia in 1830, and he described the state's principal traffic now consists in raising slaves for the more southern parts, becoming a complete slave nursery. So this is the landscape of, what slavery was leading up to the Civil War in Virginia. And so the contraband of war policy is the name of the policy that was introduced by Union Army Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler on May 23rd, 1861, which was the same night that Virginians were getting together to vote to ratify the decision to secede from the Union and pledge allegiance to the rebel Confederate side of the Civil War. On that same night, three men, Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend, escaped from their enslavement and made it to Fort Monroe in Hampton. Um, the important and maybe ironic point to make here is that Fort Monroe is the very same spot where 242 years earlier, the first Africans were brought to Virginia in 1619, where the first Africans touched land in America in 1619. So 200, almost 250 years later, this would be a very important spot where the tides of the Civil War shifted by these Black people who were self-emancipating and joining the ranks of the Union Army. It's important to note that Lincoln, as many people here probably know, really didn't have any intention of dealing with slavery in the Civil War. He was, the goal was to preserve the Union. He didn't want to interfere with that institution in the states where it already existed. And moreover, there was a Fugitive Slave Act that actually required at the time for enslavers to return slaves that escaped from a slave state, even if they were in currently free territory. So I spent a little bit of time talking about the importance of using this language of contraband of war, how even Northerners weren't really on board with emancipation of enslaved people, but they were very much willing to get behind this sort of sleight of tongue, which gave them sort of a loophole to say, okay, well, in this instance, we are on board with these formerly enslaved people being declared contraband. Like we can confiscate them from the Confederates because otherwise they'll be working in their favor, even if we are not fully on board with their emancipation. And so I spent a little bit more time here talking about, again, another point from W.B. Du Bois's scholarship in his book, Black Reconstruction. He likens the enslaved populations of Africans leaving the plantation during the Civil War. He likens them to a unpaid enslaved worker class and calls this sort of flight from the plantation in this time as a general strike. They're putting down their tools and instead of working for the Confederate enslavers, they are, transferring their power to the Union Army. This was an important sort of moment and tipping the scales in the Union's favor in this war. And so lastly, before we get into the data, I'll just point out a few more narratives that I've pulled into this essay here. So we've got the Richard Slaughter. Harriet Jacobs was a self-emancipated woman, not from Virginia, but she had self-emancipated long before the Civil War. But during the Civil War in 1862, she was spending time visiting various contraband camps. So these are the camps where the Black people who escaped to the Union armies would spend their time, working and serving the Union armies that was coming through their area. So she visited these camps and noted their conditions, noted the people that she saw there, some of their backstories, and published her letter to William Lloyd Garrison in the abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. And her article was called Life Among the Contrabands. So you can click here and read that full excerpt there. And then I have two more pieces here, and these are actually from white men at the time. This bottom right here is a journal from John Frederick Pearson, who was a Civil War lieutenant. Trenton pointed me to this journal that they maintain physically here and told me there was a journal entry where he describes witnessing these fugitives trying to escape on boat from the rebel side of the shore in Hampton to their Union lines. And then lastly, there's another note here from Edward Pierce, who I didn't transcribe this full article, but he has an article where from the Atlantic in November 1861, where he discusses his encounters with the contrabands at the time and their thoughts on freedom, their thoughts on the Civil War, on family separation, and what their experiences were. So all that to say, that's setting the scene and the context for what I call this Archive Explorer here, which is really this data dashboard of the Library of Virginia's archive, where you can see out of the 5,000 people that are recorded in the archive, what the distribution looks like of the ages of people represented here, what the balance of gender, at least that was recorded, looks like. If you think back to that map we saw of the 1860 slave population in Virginia, we can see, around those same areas that were the most predominant concentration of enslaved people, that also sort of mimics where we see sort of the dominance of this archive here. Um, and so you can click around and see there's people up to age 80 in this collection who've escaped. There's 21 people under age 1 that were recorded as being taken with their families when they escaped. And as you click through these filters, you'll see a table here at the very bottom, which allows you to just browse all of the individuals named in the collection here. And just as before, you can sort of view a copy of the record here, and then you can also click to go to see the source record. So I've been talking at y'all for a minute now, and we're at 12:45. So I'm gonna pause here and say this is the current version, the current state of this project, where I hope throughout the rest of the summer to complete it and get it all the way up to date with some of those other archives and collections that I mentioned, like the still records. But I'm excited to finally have this public and share with you all the current version of this project. And in my mind, like, the work really can begin now, because again, I created this project because I wanted to find an easier way to sort of navigate and explore and dig through some of these records. And I think this is a tool that will help me do that. And hopefully, for other genealogists, historians, and folks out there, it might be of some utility to you too. So I'll stop there. Thank y'all for listening.
Thank you, Tevin. That is just amazing, right? I mean, the work that I know that you've done shows, and the comments that are in the chat box. I mean, incredible piece of work, fantastic resource, powerful and ambitious. Of course, folks were wondering how it can be used in the classroom. And I think it's important that there's so much here: material for students, there's material for scholars. You have a lot of background material, so lay people can also learn quite a bit, and I think it's going to be engaging to them as well. So we've got some time for questions. Tevin, I think there was a board member from the Contraband Historical Society who wondered if they could link to the database from their website. And so do you want to speak to how you want this to be shared and any ways it can get out to the larger universe?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely open to the link being shared by by the Contraband Historical Society. I was really hoping to make some time to actually connect with y'all over the last couple weeks and haven't had a chance to. So I will be reaching out to connect with the Contraband Historical Society, but in the meantime, definitely feel free to share this link, fugitivedataportraits.com, wherever you see fit.
Was there data you were hoping to get, but could not?
I don't necessarily know if I was hoping to get or expecting to get, but it really wasn't until I started to visualize and sort of piece together these visualizations where I could see which gaps existed in the collection that I'm working with. And so in the Q&A with the LVA archivist at the early part of this webpage, there's a question in there that says, how should we interpret or think about missing data in there? So that team does a good job of explaining sort of how some records either maybe never existed because of inconsistent record keeping at the time, how oftentimes they were burned or stolen or lost, during the Civil War or at any other time. Um, so I think with I don't think there was records necessarily that I was hoping to get from this collection specifically. I think throughout my work on this project, there's more narratives that I hope in the future to be able to pull in to contextualize these. And I think that's just a matter of time. There was only so many books and interviews and transcripts that I was able to read in this sort of 4 or 8 month period to include, but I hope to include more of them. And I hope that the William Still records that I plan to include, this is a table, just as I'm speaking now, this is a table of some of the William Still data, but each row in this table is actually accompanied by a full sort of written account of someone's journey to Philadelphia and someone's sort of background of who they are. So those narratives, which are actually more rich text that I can look into and fully analyze, were the sorts of narratives that I was hoping to get to while working on this project. And so I found them, but that's sort of the next phase of this work is to incorporate them a little more.
This is the tip of the iceberg that Tevn's presented to us today. There are many modules that are there that he didn't talk about. And even this particular module, there's much more that people can explore. And Tevn, I'm guessing for folks that go to the website and may have questions while they're in the websites, is there a way that they can contact you? Is there a way that they can subscribe to the page? Oh, there it is.
Yeah, so two buttons down here that you'll find on the footer of every page. You can email me directly, Tev'n@tev.dev, or you can enter your email here, and this will subscribe you to a newsletter that I won't be spamming folks often, but anytime there's an update, to say that, there's a new part of the website ready or any sort of fix or major updates to it, that's where I'll be communicating from. So email, LinkedIn here, or the newsletter. Those will probably be the best ways to get in touch with me. I'm not hard to find.
Perfect, perfect. Somebody asked, is the data available to the public? And I can answer that question. It is, just as it was available to Tevn and to any scholars. I think we dropped the Virginia Untold link earlier in the chat, but we also have millions and millions of documents that have not been digitized in various other forms. So yes, the data is available to the public. The reading rooms are open Tuesday through Friday, 9 to 5, and then I think 2 Saturdays a month from 10 to 5, 10 to 4. Have you been able to contact descendants of those listed here?
I have not been able to contact descendants of those. Definitely not listed in this collection. A lot of times what you see is that there's only first names here. So I'm hoping that this tool is of some use to folks doing genealogy and research of that nature that can say I'm the descendant of someone, in here, and I'm very much open to connecting with folks that way. And then I know that there are descendant organizations and societies in Virginia that, I hope to connect with and share this project with in case folks in their membership believe they have ancestors in these records.
Was there anything either surprising or revelatory or inspiring as you sort of went through all of this amazing information?
Where to begin? I mean, I'll first say I think as someone who, like you said, doesn't come from a training background in humanities, like in the conferences I've been to, the conversations I've had with folks about this project, I've just had a lot of people offer support and help, resources, point me in directions to different resources to explore. And so I think the biggest one of the biggest benefits to me in this project has been that there's been just a whole community of people who found an interest in this project and have lent their expertise to help me find my way through it. And I think I'm trying to say I appreciate the change in work style that I've had to sort of adapt while working on this project. I think working in tech and working on software, there's a big common push to, produce quickly, to build quickly. And I think by nature of the project that I was working on, and by nature of just having to open up a lot of books, open up a lot of primary source materials that are written in 1800s cursive that I was forced to sort of slow down, that I was forced to take my time transcribing things, take my time reading narratives, take my time sort of piecing together different components of various archives and trying to draw connections to them. So I appreciated the space of again having this fellowship to take that time. Um, but yeah, I don't know if it was all that surprising, but it was a welcome sort of change of pace and change of work mode for me, coming from primarily working in tech communities and spaces.
Collaboration between the Library of Virginia and Virginia Humanities is it's about a decade old, and it's been an amazing collaboration. I think certainly, hopefully for the scholars, certainly for the library, and for Virginia Humanities. Mostly those collaborations have resulted in book projects, traditional manuscript projects. But I think yours is amazing in sort of that next level and trying to bring in all the best of the digital world with scholarship, with real data that people can mine for a variety of different uses. What do you have sort of next on your immediate field of vision?
Yeah, so there's a few more pages on this website that are just stubbed out, but that over the summer we'll be completing. I mentioned the William Still records, and so similar to the essay that we just viewed, I hope to do a similar treatment for the collection of narratives that he compiled. And the great thing about that collection is while 300 of those testimonies are from people who escaped from Virginia, there's still hundreds more from people escaping from other states. And so what you can then do then is sort of, again, this project focuses on Virginia, but it helps to contextualize the experience of people escaping from Virginia by looking at how those experiences differ or uh, were similar to people escaping from other states. And so the still records are next. There's a page that I hope to use, this here self-emancipation page, which I hope to use as sort of a hub of other digital projects working in this space of scholarship on slavery or self-emancipation, like Freedom on the Move, which collects fugitive slave ads, Dangerous Harbors, which is I think is a project out of Virginia State University, which looks at slavery in colonial Virginia. But I want to do this sort of timeline going through different slave rebellions, through the history of self-emancipation, through marriage, the institutions involved in these parts of the enterprise, and outline them here on this page as well. So that's what's next for this project.
Just looking at the chats is you're gone crazy, and that's the best mark of a of an excellent project and a presentation. So lots of people engaged. Thank you, Tevin, for all of your amazing work, and good luck on this project in the future.
Thank you very much, and thank you all who dropped in to listen. I appreciate it.